Billionaire invited his ex for Christmas to show he moved on, until she arrived holding a baby. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. Julian Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching snow dust the city below like powdered sugar on dark velvet. At 39, he cut an impressive figure, 6'3" with broad shoulders that filled his charcoal wool sweater perfectly, dark brown hair styled in a precise fade that emphasized his strong jawline, and steel gray eyes that had learned to mask vulnerability behind calculated confidence. 2 years of therapy had taught him to recognize his tells, the way his jaw tightened when he felt exposed, how his fingers drummed against his thigh when anxiety crept in. Tonight, neither was happening. He felt controlled, ready. "Mr. Ashford?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The caterers are confirmed for Christmas Eve, and the invitations have been sent." Julian's reflection stared back at him from the window. A man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up after his world crumbled. The divorce papers were signed exactly 24 months ago. The therapy sessions that followed had been brutal but necessary. His biotech company, Nutrigenesis, had not only survived his personal chaos but thrived, making him one of the youngest billionaires in food biotechnology. He was ready to show everyone, especially her, that Julian Ashford had not just survived. He had conquered. "All of them?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Yes, sir, including Ms. Moore." The name hung in the air like expensive cologne, present but not overwhelming. Delilah. He'd practiced saying it in therapy until it lost its power to make his chest tighten. Dr. Reeves had called it exposure therapy. Julian called it necessary armor. He turned from the window and walked to his desk where the guest list lay beneath the glow of a brass lamp. 23 names. Business associates, family friends, his sister Caroline with her husband and kids, and at the bottom, written in his own careful script, Delilah Moore. The rational part of his brain, the part that had learned to separate emotion from strategy, knew this dinner was about closure, a mature, civilized way to demonstrate that their shared past no longer held any power over him. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of professional distance. Formal paper, elegant font, no personal message beyond the standard details. But in the quiet of his penthouse, with Manhattan glittering below and Christmas 2 weeks away, Julian allowed himself one moment of complete honesty. This wasn't about closure. This was about winning. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. Caroline's name flashed on the screen. "You're really doing this?" His sister's voice carried that particular blend of concern and exasperation that only family could master. "Doing what?" Julian settled into his leather chair, the one that had cost more than most people's cars. Everything in his life now was deliberate, a careful construction of success and stability, inviting Delilah to Christmas dinner like some kind of emotional gladiator match. Julian's jaw tightened, just slightly. "It's a dinner, Caroline, not a battlefield." "Then why do you sound like you're planning a corporate takeover?" "Because that's exactly what this felt like. I'm being mature about this. We were married for 3 years. We have mutual friends. It would be strange not to include her." "Julian." Caroline's voice softened, and he could picture her in her cozy Connecticut kitchen, probably making cookies with flour in her auburn hair. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, especially not to her." But that's where Caroline was wrong. He had everything to prove. That the man who had fallen apart during their divorce, who had panic attacks in board meetings and couldn't sleep for weeks, no longer existed. That Julian Ashford had evolved into something stronger, more refined, untouchable. "The dinner will be perfect," he said, ending the call before Caroline could argue further. He walked to the bar cart in the corner, crystal decanters filled with whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and poured himself 2 fingers of 18-year-old Macallan. The liquid amber caught the light like liquid gold, warming him as it went down. Through the windows, Christmas lights twinkled across the city like earthbound stars. Families gathering, couples sharing quiet moments, children dreaming of morning surprises. Julian had none of those things now. By choice, he reminded himself. By careful, deliberate choice. His reflection in the window showed a man in complete control of his universe. Successful, wealthy, desired by dozens of women whose names he barely remembered. He was everything society said a man should be. So why did the thought of Delilah walking through his door in 2 weeks make his carefully constructed world feel as fragile as spun glass? Julian finished his drink and set the crystal tumbler down with a decisive clink. Whatever game this was, whatever test of his evolution this dinner represented, he was ready. He had to be. Because if 24 months of rebuilding himself had taught him anything, it was this. Julian Ashford always won in the end. Even when he wasn't entirely sure what winning meant anymore, the city sparkled below him, full of Christmas magic and second chances he no longer believed in. But that was fine. He had something better than magic now. He had control. And in 2 weeks, when Delilah Moore walked into his perfectly orchestrated Christmas dinner, she would see exactly what she had lost. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake unique and ephemeral, melting the moment it touched the warm glass of his window. Delilah Moore stared at the cream-colored invitation lying on her kitchen counter, like an elegant piece of evidence from a life that no longer belonged to her. The paper felt expensive beneath her fingertips, the kind Julian had always preferred, heavy stock with subtle texture that whispered sophistication rather than shouting it. At 32, she had learned to find beauty in simpler things. Her honey-blonde hair, now longer than Julian had ever seen it, was pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed the delicate curve of her neck. Her sapphire blue eyes, once bright with shared dreams, had developed a deeper quality, the kind that came from nights spent soothing a crying baby and mornings that started before dawn. She wore a soft lavender sweater over dark jeans, clothes that prioritized comfort and movement over impression. The small apartment in Brooklyn was a far cry from the Manhattan penthouse they'd once shared, but it was hers. Every mismatched piece of furniture told a story of starting over, of building something real with her own hands. Sunlight streamed through gauze curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny prayers in the air. From the living room came the sound of blocks tumbling to the floor, followed by delighted giggling. Elliot, 18 months of pure energy wrapped in overalls and a striped shirt, had discovered that knocking down towers was far more entertaining than building them. Again, he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying that particular joy that only toddlers possessed. Dark brown hair that fell in soft waves across his forehead, eyes the exact shade of steel gray that Delilah knew by heart, and a smile that could light up the entire borough. Julian's smile, Julian's eyes, Julian's stubborn chin that jutted forward when he was determined. Delilah's heart clenched the way it always did when she caught glimpses of his father in their son's face. 18 months of loving this child with every fiber of her being. 18 months of wondering what might have been different if one phone call had gone through, if one message had reached its destination. She picked up the invitation again, reading the formal script. The pleasure of your company is requested at a Christmas dinner. The pleasure of her company. As if they were acquaintances who'd lost touch, not two people who'd once promised each other forever, and then watched that promise crumble under the weight of Julian's anxiety attacks and her own desperate attempts to hold them together. Her phone buzzed against the counter. A text from her best friend Maya. Please tell me you're not seriously considering this emotional suicide mission. Delilah smiled despite herself. Maya Chen, pediatric nurse and fearless champion of wounded hearts everywhere, had been the one to drive her to the hospital when her water broke, the one who'd stayed up all night during Elliot's first fever, the one who'd never once suggested that Julian deserved to know about his son. Not until you're ready, Maya had said. Not until you decide what's best for both of you. But ready for what exactly? Ready to watch Julian's face when he realized what the breakdown of their marriage had cost him? Ready to explain why she'd tried to call him 17 times in the weeks after their divorce was finalized, only to reach a disconnected number? Ready to tell him that their son's first word had been Dada, spoken to an empty room? Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway, dragging his stuffed elephant behind him. Mama, he said, reaching up with chubby arms that could solve any problem in her world simply by wrapping around her neck. She scooped him up, breathing in his baby scent, Johnson's shampoo, and something indefinably sweet that belonged only to him. Hey, my love, are you building cities or destroying them today? Boom, he declared, apparently choosing chaos over construction. I see. Very important work. He settled against her hip with the easy trust of a child who'd never known a world where his mother wasn't there, where someone might leave without warning or explanation, where promises could be broken by anxiety attacks and pride, and the terrible weight of loving someone who couldn't love themselves. The invitation seemed to pulse with potential energy. Julian thought he was extending an olive branch, a mature gesture of moved-onness. He had no idea he was holding a match to dynamite. Delilah's phone rang. Her mother's contact photo filled the screen. A woman with silver hair and knowing eyes who'd raised 3 daughters to be strong and 2 grandchildren to call her Nana. "You got it, didn't you?" Helen Moore's voice carried that particular maternal radar that could sense emotional turmoil across state lines. "Got what?" Delilah adjusted Elliot on her hip, walking to the window that overlooked the small playground where she took him every morning. "The invitation. Julian's assistant called the clinic where you used to work. Someone gave her your address." Of course. Julian's thoroughness had always been both impressive and slightly terrifying. When he wanted something, obstacles simply disappeared. "Are you going?" her mother asked gently. Elliot was playing with the ends of her hair now, his small fingers surprisingly gentle for someone who'd just been demolishing block cities. "I don't know. Honey, you've been carrying this alone for 20 months. Maybe it's time." Time for what? To watch him hate me for keeping his son from him? To explain that I tried to tell him but his number was disconnected and his assistant had been instructed not to forward personal calls? To admit that I was too proud to try harder when it became clear he didn't want to be found? Her voice cracked on the last word, and Elliot looked up at her with concern that no 18-month-old should have to feel. She smiled at him, kissing his forehead. "Sorry, baby. Mama's just thinking out loud." "Julian's not a cruel man," her mother said carefully. "Complicated, yes. Wounded, absolutely. But not cruel. He was cruel to himself, cruel enough for both of us." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything Helen Moore was too wise to say. That running away from difficult conversations rarely made them easier. That some truths grew heavier with time rather than lighter. That love, real love, didn't disappear just because it became inconvenient or painful. Elliot had grown quiet in her arms, the way he did when he was absorbing emotions he couldn't yet name. Delilah realized she was holding him too tightly and forced her muscles to relax. "What if," she began, then stopped, started again. "What if I go and it ruins everything? What if he wants to take Elliot from me? What if he doesn't want anything to do with either of us? What if," her mother said gently, "you go and finally get to stop carrying this secret alone?" After the call ended, Delilah stood in her kitchen holding her son, watching the snow begin to fall outside her window, fat flakes that turned Brooklyn into a winter postcard, covering the rough edges and making everything look possible again. Julian's invitation lay on the counter, elegant and heavy with implication. She could throw it away, pretend it never arrived, continue building the life she'd created for herself and Elliot, safe, predictable, insulated from the particular brand of devastation that came with loving Julian Ashford. Or she could do what every cell in her body was screaming at her not to do. She could go. Elliot fell asleep against her shoulder as the snow continued to fall, and Delilah found herself making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Christmas Eve was 2 weeks away. Time enough to find courage, or at least to find the strength to do what was right instead of what was safe. Because somewhere in Manhattan, in a penthouse filled with expensive whiskey and carefully constructed defenses, was a man who had no idea that the son he'd never met was about to change everything he thought he knew about winning. The Nutrigenesis headquarters gleamed like a temple to innovation in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. Julian stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, reviewing the quarterly reports that had just made him $300 million richer. The numbers should have felt like victory, and they did, in the abstract way that all his victories felt these days. Clean, measurable, safely removed from anything that could hurt him. His reflection in the conference table's polished surface showed a man who had mastered the art of appearing invincible. The charcoal Tom Ford suit had been tailored to perfection, emphasizing his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was styled with just enough product to look effortless, and the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist cost more than most people's houses. Everything about Julian Ashford screamed success. Everything except the barely perceptible tremor in his left hand when he thought no one was looking. "Sir?" His assistant Rebecca appeared in the doorway, with the careful neutrality that all good assistants perfected. 26, efficient and smart enough to never ask personal questions. "Your sister is here." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Caroline never visited his office unless she had something important to say, and given their last conversation about the Christmas dinner, he suspected he knew what this was about. Carolyn Ashford Mills swept into his office like a force of nature wrapped in a camel-colored coat and designer boots. At 35, she had their mother's auburn hair and their father's steel gray eyes. But unlike Julian, she'd never learned to hide her emotions behind corporate armor. Her expression was a masterpiece of sisterly concern mixed with barely contained frustration. "Before you say anything," Julian began, not looking up from his reports, "the answer is still no. I haven't asked you anything yet. But you're going to. And whatever it is, canceling the dinner, uninviting Delilah, admitting that this is all an elaborate exercise in emotional self-harm, the answer is no." Caroline settled into the chair across from his desk with the grace of someone who'd grown up in boardrooms and country clubs. "Julian, look at me." He kept his eyes on the quarterly projections, though the numbers had stopped making sense somewhere around the third paragraph. "I'm working." "No, you're hiding. There's a difference." The words hit harder than they should have. Julian finally looked up, meeting his sister's gaze with the practiced indifference he'd perfected over 24 months of therapy and pharmaceutical assistance. "I'm not hiding from anything. I'm preparing for a dinner party." A dinner party. Caroline's voice carried that particular tone she'd used since they were children, the one that meant she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. "Julian, do you remember what you were like when Delilah left?" The tremor in his hand increased almost imperceptibly. "That's not relevant. You didn't sleep for 6 weeks. You had panic attacks in board meetings. You lost 30 pounds and looked like you were dying. That was 24 months ago." His voice remained steady, professionally controlled. "I'm not the same person." "No, you're not. You're more controlled, more isolated, and somehow even more terrified of being vulnerable than you were before." The words hung between them like smoke from an expensive cigarette. Sophisticated, toxic, impossible to ignore. Julian stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that projected confidence while hiding the tremor that had become his constant companion. From this height, Manhattan looked manageable, orderly. The people below were tiny figures moving in predictable patterns, and he was safely above it all, insulated by success and prescription anxiety medication, and the kind of wealth that could solve any problem except the ones that mattered. "Dr. Reeves says I've made remarkable progress," he said without turning around. "Dr. Reeves also says you've built walls so high that even you can't see over them anymore." Julian's reflection in the window showed a man who looked like he had everything. Behind him, Caroline's reflection showed a woman who knew better. "I spoke with my therapist about this dinner," he lied smoothly. The truth was that he'd canceled his last 3 sessions because Dr. Reeves had started asking uncomfortable questions about his motivations. And what did this imaginary conversation reveal? Despite everything, Julian almost smiled. Caroline had always been able to see through his carefully constructed facades. It was both her greatest gift and his greatest irritation. It revealed that I'm ready to move forward. Delilah and I were married for 3 years. We have history, shared connections. It would be immature not to include her in a social gathering with mutual friends. Mutual friends who haven't seen her since the divorce because you made it clear that choosing sides was necessary. The observation struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. In the aftermath of their split, Julian's social circle had naturally gravitated toward him, the one with the money, the connections, the ability to make their lives easier or more difficult depending on his mood. Delilah had simply disappeared from their world, by his design, if he was being honest, which he wasn't, even with himself. "That's not how it happened," he said, though they both knew it was exactly how it had happened. Caroline stood and joined him at the window, her reflection appearing beside his in the glass. "Jules, what are you really trying to prove here?" The old nickname hit him like a physical blow. Caroline was the only person who still called him that, the only one who remembered the boy who'd built blanket forts and collected baseball cards and cried when their golden retriever died. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm living my life. This isn't living. This is performing." Her voice softened. "You've spent 24 months constructing this perfect image of a man who has everything under control, but you're still taking Xanax before every social event, and you haven't had a real conversation with another human being that didn't involve quarterly projections or strategic planning." Julian's jaw tightened. "My personal life is fine. Your personal life consists of a series of beautiful, interchangeable women whose names you forget before the second date, and business associates who laugh at your jokes because you sign their paychecks. That's enough." "No, it's not." Caroline turned to face him directly. "I love you, but you're about to do something incredibly stupid, and I can't watch you destroy yourself again." "I'm not destroying myself. I'm having a dinner party. You're inviting your ex-wife to watch you perform the role of a man who has moved on completely, when the truth is, you think about her every single day, and you're terrified that seeing her again will prove that all this control you've built is just an expensive illusion. The words hit him like shards of glass, each one finding a target he'd thought was safely protected. Julian turned away from the window, from Caroline's knowing gaze, from his own reflection that suddenly looked less like a successful CEO and more like a frightened man in an expensive suit. "Get out of my office," he said quietly. "Julian, get out." Caroline gathered her purse and coat with the dignified grace that had carried her through decades of dealing with the Ashford men and their legendary emotional constipation. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, I hope she comes. I hope she walks into that perfect dinner party and reminds you that some things are more important than being in control." After she left, Julian stood alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his success and the echoes of uncomfortable truths. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, covering Manhattan in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. He walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, revealing a small velvet box he hadn't looked at in 24 months. Inside was Delilah's engagement ring, 3 carats of perfect clarity that had once symbolized a future full of shared dreams and whispered promises. He'd never been able to bring himself to sell it, though he couldn't say why. Julian closed the box and returned it to the drawer, his hand steady now. In 11 days, Delilah would walk into his penthouse, and she would see exactly what Julian Ashford had become in her absence. Perfect, controlled, completely untouchable. And if the sight of her undid 24 months of carefully constructed armor, well, that was a risk he was prepared to take. Because winning, Julian had learned, sometimes required the courage to lose everything. The pediatric nutrition clinic where Delilah worked hummed with the particular energy of children discovering that healthy food could actually taste good. She stood in the teaching kitchen, watching 7-year-old Marcus tentatively bite into a sweet potato fry she'd helped him bake, his eyes widening with surprise and delight. "It's actually good," he announced to his mother, who looked like she might cry with relief. "That's because we made it together," Delilah said, crouching to Marcus's level. "Food tastes better when you're part of the process." At 32, she had found her calling in these small moments of transformation. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore scrubs decorated with tiny vegetables that made the children laugh. The work fed something in her soul that had been hungry since the divorce, the need to nurture, to heal, to make something better than it was before. But today, even the joy of watching Marcus discover that vegetables could be delicious couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered 10 days like a countdown to something she couldn't name. "Doctor." "More?" Maya appeared in the doorway of the teaching kitchen using the formal title that still made Delilah feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. "Your last appointment canceled. Want to grab coffee?" Maya Chen was everything Delilah wasn't. 5'2" to Delilah's 5'6". Quick to laugh where Delilah was quick to worry, and completely fearless when it came to speaking uncomfortable truths. They'd met during Delilah's pregnancy when Maya was the pediatric nurse who'd taught her breathing techniques and held her hand during the ultrasounds where Julian should have been. 20 minutes later, they sat in their usual corner booth at Café Luna, a Brooklyn coffee shop that served the kind of honest food that reminded Delilah why she'd fallen in love with nutrition in the first place. Maya's dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a pen, and her scrubs bore the evidence of a particularly enthusiastic finger-painting session with her 3-year-old patients. "So," Maya said, cutting directly to the heart of things the way she always did, "have you decided whether you're going to this emotional suicide mission disguised as a dinner party?" Delilah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "I keep telling myself it's the right thing to do, that Elliot deserves to know his father. And what do you deserve?" The question hung between them like incense, present, impossible to ignore, vaguely sacred. Delilah had spent 24 months focusing on what everyone else needed or deserved. What Elliot needed, what Julian might have needed if he'd bothered to maintain contact, what her patients needed, what her family needed her to be. What she needed had become an abstract concept, like a foreign language she'd once spoken fluently but had forgotten through disuse. "I deserve to stop carrying this secret," she said finally. "I'm tired, Maya. I'm tired of wondering what if every time Elliot does something that reminds me of Julian. I'm tired of having imaginary conversations with a man who doesn't even know he has a son." Maya leaned forward, her expression shifting from playful to serious. "Tell me about the last time you tried to contact him. Really tried." Delilah's chest tightened the way it always did when she thought about those weeks after Elliot was born. The desperation, the frustration, the growing realization that Julian had made himself unreachable in every way that mattered. "It was 3 days after Elliot was born," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was sitting in the hospital room, holding this perfect little boy who had Julian's eyes, and I knew I had to try one more time." She could still remember the weight of her phone in her shaking hands, the way her heart had raced as she dialed the number she'd memorized years ago. The robotic voice that had shattered her last hope. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." I called his office. The receptionist was polite but firm. "Mr. Ashford had instructed that no personal calls be forwarded. I sent emails to addresses I thought might still work. They all bounced back." Maya's expression had grown progressively darker as the story unfolded. "He cut off every avenue of communication. Not intentionally, maybe, but yes." Delilah stared into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she'd stopped asking. "I could have tried harder, shown up at his office, demanded to speak with him, but I was exhausted and proud and hurt, and I had this newborn baby who needed me to be present instead of chasing ghosts. You were protecting yourself, and Elliot. Was I? Or was I just too scared to face the possibility that he really, truly didn't want anything to do with us?" The question had haunted her for 18 months. In the quiet hours when Elliot slept and Brooklyn hummed with evening sounds beyond her windows, she'd wondered if Julian's communication blackout had been a message itself, a final, definitive statement that their chapter was closed. Maya reached across the table and covered Delilah's hand with her own. "Honey, you tried to tell him. Multiple times. The fact that he'd made himself unreachable doesn't make you the villain in this story. Then why do I feel like I am? Because you loved him. And love makes us feel responsible for things that are completely outside our control." The simple truth hit Delilah like a physical blow. She had loved Julian Ashford, with the kind of intensity that rewrote the fundamental structure of her world. When that love couldn't save him from his anxiety, couldn't bridge the gap between his need for control and her need for genuine intimacy, couldn't survive the weight of his perfectionism and her growing exhaustion with being perfect, she'd felt like she'd failed at the most important thing she'd ever attempted. "I used to lie awake at night wondering if there was something I could have said differently," she admitted. "Some way I could have helped him see that being vulnerable wasn't the same as being weak. And now I lie awake wondering if Elliot will grow up thinking his father didn't want him, when the truth is his father never knew he existed." Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing the complexity of a situation that had no easy answers. Around them, the cafe buzzed with the comfortable sounds of afternoon conversations and the espresso machine's gentle hiss. "So you're going to go?" Maya said finally. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to go. And you're going to tell him about Elliot." Delilah's hands tightened around her mug. "I'm going to try. If I can find the courage. If the right moment presents itself. If I don't lose my nerve completely. What if he's angry that you didn't try harder to reach him? Then I'll deal with his anger. What if he wants to be part of Elliot's life? Then I'll figure out how to co-parent with a man I used to be married to. What if seeing him again makes you remember why you loved him in the first place?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Delilah had spent 24 months convincing herself that what she'd felt for Julian was a young woman's infatuation with wealth and sophistication, that the man she'd married was a carefully constructed illusion that had cracked under pressure, revealing someone she didn't recognize underneath. But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. "Then I'll remember why I left," she said quietly. "And I'll remember that some people are only capable of loving from a distance." Maya squeezed her hand. "For what it's worth, I think you're brave as hell. I think I'm terrified as hell. Sometimes those are the same thing." Later, as Delilah walked through Brooklyn's snow-dusted streets toward home, she thought about courage and terror, and the strange alchemy that sometimes transformed one into the other. In 9 days, she would put on her best dress, arrange childcare for Elliot, and walk back into Julian Ashford's world. She would carry with her 18 months of secret motherhood, 24 months of unanswered questions, and the weight of a love that had never quite figured out how to die, and maybe, if she was very brave and very lucky, she would finally get to stop carrying that weight alone. 1 week before Christmas Eve, Manhattan transformed into a glittering wonderland of possibility and pretense. Julian stood in his penthouse kitchen at 6 in the morning, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows, while his Italian espresso machine hummed its expensive song. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning Central Park into a postcard and his carefully ordered world into something that felt dangerously close to magic. He wore charcoal gray pajama pants and a white t-shirt that revealed the results of 24 months of religious gym attendance. Broad shoulders, defined arms, a chest that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. His dark hair was disheveled from sleep, making him look younger, more vulnerable than the man who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. But his hands were steady this morning. No tremor, no need for the small white pill that usually accompanied his coffee ritual. For the first time in months, Julian felt completely in control. The feeling should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified him. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop. A text from his event coordinator. Final headcount needed by tomorrow. Catering requires 24-hour notice for menu adjustments. 23 confirmed guests. 22 who would witness his carefully orchestrated demonstration of evolution and success. And one who held the power to unravel everything he'd spent 24 months building. Julian scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Reeves's number. His thumb hovered over the call button for 30 seconds before he set the phone down without dialing. Some conversations were better avoided, especially when they might involve uncomfortable questions about motivation and emotional readiness. Instead, he opened his laptop and reviewed the seating arrangements he'd spent an embarrassing amount of time perfecting. Delilah would be seated across from him, where he could watch her face when she saw what he'd become. Close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the illusion of casual indifference. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. So why did he feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff waiting for someone to push him? Across the city in Brooklyn, Delilah stood in her small bathroom at the same hour, staring at her reflection in a mirror that had seen better days. She'd been awake since 4, unable to silence the voice in her head that whispered an endless loop of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Her honey blonde hair fell in waves around her shoulders, still damp from the shower she'd hoped would wash away her anxiety. Her sapphire blue eyes showed the strain of a week spent alternating between determination and terror, and her usually steady hands shook slightly as she applied mascara with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to let anything be less than perfect. From down the hall came the sound of Elliot's morning babbling, a mix of actual words and the delighted nonsense that 18-month-olds use to narrate their discoveries. Today he'd discovered that his stuffed elephant could fly from his crib to the floor with spectacular results. "Mama, effant," he called, his voice carrying the particular urgency that meant either something wonderful or something terrible had happened. Delilah found him standing in his crib, arms raised in victory, his dark hair sticking up in 6 different directions, and his gray eyes, Julian's eyes, bright with mischief. The elephant lay on the floor beside a pile of books that had apparently been enlisted as co-conspirators in the flying experiment. "I see someone's been busy," she said, lifting him into her arms and breathing in his baby scent. "Did you and Elephant have a good flight?" "Fly," Elliot agreed enthusiastically, then spotted something even more interesting across the room. "Book!" They settled into the rocking chair by the window, Elliot on her lap with his favorite picture book about farm animals. This was their morning ritual. Quiet time before the day began, before the world demanded decisions and courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "Moo," Elliot said seriously, pointing to the cow on page 3. "That's right. Very good cow sound." He looked up at her with the focused attention that always surprised her. Children were so present, so completely engaged with whatever was directly in front of them. They didn't waste energy worrying about conversations that might happen, or relationships that might change, or fathers who might reject them. "Mama sad?" he asked, his small hand patting her cheek with the gentle concern that made her heart ache. "Not sad, baby. Just thinking. Think happy," he advised with the wisdom of someone who had never learned that happiness was sometimes a choice rather than a default state. Delilah kissed his forehead, marveling at how someone so small could carry such enormous power to heal the wounded places in her heart. "You're right. Happy thoughts." But as they read about farm animals, and Elliot provided his own sound effects for each page, her mind wandered to the conversation she would have to have in 7 days. The words she would need to find to explain 18 months of secrecy. The courage she would need to summon to face Julian's reaction, whatever that might be. Her phone rang from the kitchen. Maya's contact photo filled the screen, a selfie of her making a ridiculous face while wearing reindeer antlers. "Please tell me you're not having second thoughts," Maya said without preamble. "I'm having 37th thoughts," Delilah admitted, shifting Elliot on her lap as he discovered a page with a particularly fascinating pig illustration. That's actually progress. Yesterday you were only up to 24 thoughts. Despite everything, Delilah smiled. Maya had the gift of finding levity in the darkest situations without minimizing their weight. I keep thinking about what happens after. If Julian wants to be part of Elliot's life, how do we navigate that? If he doesn't, how do I explain that to Elliot when he's old enough to ask questions? Cross that bridge when you come to it. Right now, focus on getting to the bridge in the first place. Elliot had grown bored with the book and was now investigating the texture of Delilah's sweater with the scientific precision of someone conducting important fabric research. What if I'm making a terrible mistake? Delilah asked. What if this ruins the life we've built here? What if it gives you both something you didn't know you were missing? The question hung in the air like morning light, full of possibility and slightly blinding. Delilah had become so focused on protecting what she had that she'd stopped considering what might be possible. I bought a dress, she said suddenly. For the dinner? Navy blue, simple but elegant. I wanted to look, I don't know, like I belong in his world again, even though I'm not sure I ever really did. You belonged in his world when he was part of yours, Maya said gently. The question isn't whether you fit into his life now. The question is whether he's capable of stepping into yours. After the call ended, Delilah sat in the rocking chair with Elliot, watching the snow fall outside their window and thinking about courage and belonging, and the strange mathematics of love that never quite added up the way it should. In 7 days, she would put on her navy dress and walk back into Julian's carefully constructed universe. She would carry with her 18 months of single motherhood, 24 months of unanswered questions, and a secret that would change everything. The only question was whether they would both survive the impact when her truth collided with his perfectly controlled world. That evening, Julian stood in his walk-in closet, selecting the suit he would wear to his own performance. Tom Ford, midnight blue, cut to perfection. The armor of a man who had learned that appearance could compensate for almost any internal uncertainty. His reflection in the full-length mirror showed someone who looked ready for anything. But in the quiet of his penthouse with Manhattan glittering below and Christmas 6 days away, Julian allowed himself one moment of complete honesty. He missed her. Despite the therapy, despite the medication, despite 24 months of convincing himself that what they'd had was just prolonged infatuation, mixed with excellent sexual chemistry, he missed Delilah more, with an intensity that sometimes made it hard to breathe. And in 6 days, he would see her again. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in 24 months, it made him feel alive. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Manhattan look like it had been designed by angels with excellent taste in architecture. Julian stood on his penthouse terrace at 7 a.m., coffee in hand, watching the city prepare for its annual performance of joy and togetherness. The cold bit through his cashmere coat, but he welcomed the sharp reminder that today was real, that tonight was happening, that there would be no more time for second thoughts or strategic retreats. His phone had been buzzing since dawn, the caterers confirming final details, the florist ensuring the white roses and winter greenery would create the perfect backdrop for elegant conversation, his housekeeper providing updates on everything from crystal placement to bathroom amenities. Every detail had been planned with military precision, every contingency accounted for except the one that mattered most: how he would survive seeing Delilah's face again. Mr. Ashford? Rebecca's voice carried from inside, professional but tinged with the particular tension that came from working for someone whose emotional state could shift markets. Your sister is on line 1. Julian closed his eyes and took a breath that tasted like snow and expensive cologne, and the approaching end of carefully maintained illusions. Caroline's timing was impeccable and completely unwelcome. Julian. Her voice carried across the line with the authority of someone who'd been managing Ashford family crises since before she could legally vote. Tell me you're not having second thoughts about tonight. Why would I be having second thoughts? Because you've called Dr. Reeves 3 times in the past 2 days and hung up each time before the call connected. Julian's jaw tightened. Sometimes he forgot that Caroline had inherited their mother's gift for surveillance disguised as sisterly concern. I'm fine. No, you're terrified. There's a difference. Her voice softened slightly. Jules, it's not too late to call this off. Send flowers and a nice note. Suggest coffee sometime next month when you're not performing in front of an audience. The suggestion hit him like physical relief, an escape route he hadn't allowed himself to consider. He could blame the weather, claim a family emergency, invent any number of sophisticated excuses that would postpone this reckoning indefinitely. "I'm not calling anything off," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "Tonight is just a dinner party. Tonight is an emotional minefield disguised as a dinner party, and you know it." Julian walked back inside, his reflection catching in the wall of windows that separated his penthouse from the rest of humanity. He looked like a man preparing for war, perfectly dressed, strategically positioned, and absolutely certain he was about to lose. "I need to see her, Caroline. I need to know if what I've built is real or just expensive therapy." The admission hung between them like smoke, impossible to take back. Julian had spent 24 months perfecting the art of not admitting weakness, of presenting strength even when his hands shook and his chest tightened, and the weight of his own success threatened to crush him. "And what if it's just expensive therapy?" Caroline asked gently. "Then I'll deal with that too." Across the city, Delilah stood in her small bathroom, staring at the navy dress hanging on the back of the door like evidence from a crime she hadn't yet committed. The dress was beautiful, elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without trying too hard. She'd spent 3 weeks' grocery money on it, telling herself that confidence was worth the investment. Now it looked like a costume for a role she'd forgotten how to play. "Mama pretty," Elliot announced from his position on the bathroom floor, where he was conducting a serious investigation into whether his toy truck could successfully navigate the space between the toilet and the bathtub. "Thank you, baby," she said, though she felt anything but pretty. She felt like a woman preparing to detonate her own life and hoping everyone survived the explosion. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Last chance to text me if you need an emergency escape plan. I have 3 different fake medical emergencies prepared, ranging from food poisoning to appendicitis." Delilah almost smiled. Maya's dedication to friendship included contingency planning that would make military strategists weep with admiration. But running away wasn't an option anymore. She'd spent 18 months carrying this secret, and it had grown too heavy for one person to bear alone. She picked up Elliot and carried him to the living room, where his babysitter, Mrs. Chen from downstairs, was already setting up an impressive array of Christmas cookies and holiday movies designed to keep an 18-month-old entertained until well past his normal bedtime. "You have my number," Delilah said for the 3rd time, checking her purse to make sure she had everything she might need for whatever tonight would become. "And Maya's number, and the pediatrician's number, and, child, breathe, Mrs. Chen's voice carried the particular authority of someone who'd raised 4 children and countless grandchildren. "This baby will be fine. You go do whatever it is you need to do." What she needed to do was walk back into Julian's world and tell him that the life he'd carefully reconstructed was built on incomplete information. What she needed to do was look him in the eyes and say the words that would change everything for both of them. What she needed to do was find the courage to survive whatever came next. Elliot seemed to sense her emotional state with the intuitive radar that small children possessed. He wrapped his arms around her neck and pressed his face against her cheek in the kind of hug that could heal almost anything. "Love, Mama," he said seriously. "Love you too, my brave boy." She held him for a long moment, memorizing the weight of him in her arms, the baby scent that was already beginning to fade as he grew into a little boy, the complete trust in his gray eyes, Julian's eyes, that she was determined to protect no matter what happened tonight. By 5 p.m., Julian's penthouse had been transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread about how successful people celebrated Christmas. White roses and winter greenery created elegant centerpieces. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier like captured stars, and the scent of expensive candles mixed with the aroma of food that cost more per plate than most people spent on an entire meal. Julian stood in his bedroom, adjusting the midnight blue Tom Ford suit that fit him like armor designed by angels. His dark hair was styled to perfection, his face showed no trace of the sleepless nights that had preceded this moment, and his hands were completely steady. He looked like a man who had everything under control. In the mirror, he practiced the expression he would wear when Delilah arrived. Politely interested, vaguely pleased, completely unaffected by her presence. The expression of a man who had moved on so completely that seeing his ex-wife was merely a pleasant footnote to an evening of sophisticated conversation. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Delilah. I wanted to confirm I'll be there tonight. Thank you for the invitation." Julian stared at the message for 30 seconds, his carefully practiced expression cracking just slightly around the edges. She'd gotten a new phone number. Of course she had. The woman who would walk into his penthouse tonight was not the same person who'd left 24 months ago. He typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "Looking forward to seeing you." The words felt like lies and absolute truth simultaneously. At 6 p.m., the first guests began arriving. Colleagues from Nutrigenesis, friends from the country club, Caroline and her husband bearing expensive wine and matching expressions of barely concealed worry. The penthouse filled with the sounds of elegant conversation and sophisticated laughter, the kind of gathering that Julian had perfected over 24 months of proving he could build a life without emotional complexity. By 7 p.m., 22 guests had arrived, eaten canapés, admired the view, and settled into the rhythm of an evening that would be memorable for all the wrong reasons. By 7:15, Julian was checking his watch and wondering if Delilah had changed her mind. By 7:30, he was alternating between relief and disappointment, unsure which emotion was winning. At 7:37 p.m., the doorbell rang. Julian excused himself from a conversation about biotech patents and market projections, his heart rate increasing in a way that no amount of therapy or medication had been able to prevent. He walked to the front door with the measured pace of a man who was completely prepared for whatever waited on the other side. He was not prepared. When he opened the door, Delilah stood in the hallway like a vision from a life he'd convinced himself was better off forgotten. The navy dress fit her perfectly, elegant and understated, her honey blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her sapphire blue eyes met his with a mixture of determination and vulnerability that hit him like a physical blow. But it was what she carried in her arms that stopped his world completely. A baby, 18 months old, with dark hair that fell in soft waves and eyes the exact shade of steel gray that Julian saw in the mirror every morning. The child was dressed in a tiny navy suit that made him look like a miniature gentleman, and he was staring at Julian with the focused curiosity that very young children brought to new experiences. "Hello, Julian," Delilah said quietly. Julian's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis, and for the first time in 24 months he had absolutely no idea what to say. Behind him, the sounds of his perfect dinner party continued, laughter and conversation, and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. In front of him stood the woman he'd never stopped loving and a child who had his eyes. Everything he thought he knew about the last 24 months crumbled like sandcastles at high tide. "Delilah," he managed, his voice sounding strange even to himself. Who is this?" Time moved like honey in winter. Julian stood in his doorway, suspended between the life he'd built and the truth he'd never imagined, staring at a child who had his eyes, his stubborn chin, his exact shade of steel gray iris that he'd inherited from 3 generations of Ashford men. The baby, his son, dear God, his son, looked back at him with the fearless curiosity of someone who had never learned that the world could be dangerous. Small hands reached toward Julian's face with the instinctive trust that children extended to adults before life taught them to be careful. "Julian?" Delilah's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she stood only 3 feet from him. "Can we come in?" Behind him, the dinner party continued its elegant performance. Caroline's laugh carried across the penthouse, mixing with conversations about market trends and vacation homes and the kind of concerns that belong to people whose worlds weren't currently exploding. The scent of expensive candles and carefully prepared food created an atmosphere of sophistication that felt suddenly obscene in the face of what was happening in this doorway. Julian's voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Of course. Come in." He stepped aside with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from conscious thought. Delilah walked past him into the foyer, her navy dress whispering against her legs, her honey blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier. She moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo, adjusting the baby's position with practiced ease that spoke of 18 months of single motherhood. Julian closed the door and turned to face them, his back pressed against the solid wood as if he needed physical support to remain standing. The sounds of his perfect dinner party seemed to fade into background noise, overwhelmed by the roar of blood rushing through his ears and the sound of his carefully constructed world, cracking like ice in spring. "This is Elliot," Delilah said quietly, her sapphire blue eyes meeting his with a mixture of determination and terror. "He's 18 months old." The math hit Julian like a physical blow. 18 months. Their divorce had been finalized 24 months ago, but they'd been separated for months before that, living in the same house but existing in different universes of hurt and miscommunication, and the slow erosion of everything they'd once promised each other. "Elliot," Julian repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. A name he'd never helped choose, never whispered in the dark hours of early parenthood, never used to comfort or praise or express the kind of love that made people rearrange their entire lives around someone else's needs. The baby, Elliot, had grown interested in the crystal chandelier above them, pointing at it with a chubby finger, while making soft sounds of wonder. "Lights," he said clearly, turning to Delilah for confirmation that he'd correctly identified something beautiful. "Yes, baby. Pretty lights." Julian felt something break inside his chest. A clean snap like a bone under pressure, followed by pain so sharp and comprehensive that he wondered if it was possible to die from having your heart stop and start again in the space of a single breath. "He's mine," Julian said. Not a question. The evidence was written in every line of Elliot's face, every gesture that reminded Julian of his own childhood photographs. "Yes, you were pregnant when you left. I found out 3 weeks after the divorce papers were signed." Delilah's voice remained steady, but Julian could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself as if expecting attack. "I tried to call you. Your phone was disconnected. Your office wouldn't put through personal calls. I sent emails. I changed everything." The admission escaped before Julian could stop it. "After the divorce, I changed my phone number, my email, told Rebecca to screen all personal contacts. I needed to start over completely." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything in its path. Julian had burned every bridge between his old life and his new one, so desperate to escape the man he'd been during their marriage, anxious, controlling, unable to accept love without trying to manage it into submission, that he'd made himself unreachable even to someone carrying his child. "I know," Delilah said simply. "That's why I stopped trying." The quiet devastation in her voice hit him harder than anger would have. She wasn't accusing him, wasn't demanding explanations or apologies. She was simply stating facts with the exhausted patience of someone who'd spent 18 months carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear. "Mr. Ashford?" Rebecca appeared at the edge of the foyer, her professional composure intact but her eyes curious. "Your guests are asking about the dinner schedule." Julian stared at her for a moment, unable to process the words. Dinner schedule. Right. He was hosting a party. 22 people were in his living room, drinking his expensive wine and eating his carefully prepared canapés, waiting for him to play the role of charming host in the performance of his own evolution. Tell them dinner will be delayed," he managed. Rebecca nodded and disappeared back into the party, leaving Julian alone with Delilah and the child who had rewritten his entire understanding of the last 24 months in the space of 5 minutes. "Julian," Delilah began, then stopped as Caroline appeared in the foyer doorway. His sister took one look at the scene. Julian pressed against the door like a man facing execution, Delilah holding a baby with unmistakably Ashford features, and her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh my God." Elliot, apparently deciding that this new person was worth investigating, reached toward Caroline with the same fearless friendliness he'd shown Julian. "Hi," he said clearly, bestowing a smile that could have powered the entire city grid. Caroline's eyes filled with tears so quickly that Julian wondered if his own emotional state was contagious. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. "Aren't you beautiful?" "Caroline," Julian said, his voice sounding strange and distant. "This is Delilah, and this is my son." The words felt impossible, like claiming kinship with a miracle, or announcing that gravity had reversed itself. But they were true. The most important truth of his life, delivered 18 months too late in the foyer of a penthouse filled with people who had no idea they were witnessing the complete reconstruction of everything Julian thought he knew about himself. Caroline looked between Julian and Delilah with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Do you need anything? Is he hungry? Does he like music? I have pictures of Julian when he was this age. They look exactly. Caroline, Julian's voice cut through her nervous babbling. Could you handle the dinner party for a few minutes? Tell everyone I'll be right back." His sister nodded, understanding flooding her face. "Of course. Take all the time you need." She disappeared back into the party, leaving Julian and Delilah alone with the child who had changed everything simply by existing. "We need to talk," Julian said quietly. "Yes, we do. Not here. Too many people. Too much." He gestured vaguely at the sounds of elegant conversation drifting from the living room. "There's a study down the hall. Private." Delilah nodded, shifting Elliot in her arms as he began to fuss slightly. The comfort of her familiar presence versus the stimulation of new surroundings was apparently creating some internal conflict for an 18-month-old who had expected a quiet evening with Mrs. Chen and Christmas cookies. Julian led them down a hallway lined with abstract art that had cost more than most people's annual salaries, toward a room he'd designed as a sanctuary from the world. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace that projected warmth without actual flames, leather furniture that invited both conversation and contemplation. As they walked, Elliot twisted in Delilah's arms to look back at Julian, studying him with the intense focus that very young children brought to important discoveries. Then, without warning, he reached toward Julian with both arms in the universal gesture that meant pick me up. Julian stopped walking. His entire body went rigid, as if someone had asked him to defuse a bomb using only theoretical knowledge and prayer. He wants you to hold him, Delilah said softly. I've never held a baby. You'll figure it out. Julian looked at this child, his child, reaching for him with complete trust, and felt 18 months of missed moments crash over him like a wave. First smiles he'd never seen, first words he'd never heard, first steps he'd never celebrated. Christmas mornings and bedtime stories and the thousand small miracles that made up the daily architecture of loving someone from the very beginning. With movements that felt like prayer, Julian took his son into his arms for the first time. Elliot settled against his chest with the easy acceptance of someone who had never learned that fathers could be strangers. He smelled like baby shampoo and something indefinably sweet, and his weight was both negligible and world-changing. "Hi," Julian whispered, the word barely audible. "Dada?" Elliot said conversationally, as if he'd been waiting 18 months to use the word properly. Julian's careful composure finally shattered completely, and for the first time since he was a child, he began to cry. Julian's study had been designed as a refuge from the world, leather-bound books that spoke of intellectual sophistication, a fireplace that provided warmth without chaos, furniture arranged to encourage both solitude and intimate conversation. Now it felt like a confessional, heavy with the weight of 18 months of truth finally spoken. Julian sat in the leather armchair by the fireplace, Elliot still in his arms, tears streaming down his face with an honesty he hadn't accessed in years. The baby seemed fascinated by this display of emotion, reaching up with small fingers to touch Julian's wet cheeks with the gentle curiosity of someone discovering that adults could be as vulnerable as children. Delilah had taken the chair across from him, her navy dress a stark contrast against the rich burgundy leather. Her sapphire blue eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her posture remained carefully controlled. A woman who had learned to be strong when strength was the only option available. "I'm sorry," Julian whispered, the words inadequate but necessary. "God, Delilah, I'm so sorry." "For what?" Her voice was gentle, lacking the anger he deserved. "For everything. For cutting you off. For missing this." He looked down at Elliot, who had discovered the fascinating texture of Julian's silk tie and was conducting a thorough investigation. "For 18 months of not knowing he existed. You didn't know because I couldn't tell you. That's not your fault." But it was his fault, and they both knew it. Julian had burned every bridge between his old life and his new one so thoroughly that even carrying his child, Delilah couldn't reach him. He'd been so desperate to escape the man he'd been during their marriage, anxious, controlling, incapable of accepting love without trying to manage it into something safer, that he'd made himself unreachable to everyone, including the people who might have needed him most. "Tell me about him," Julian said quietly. "Tell me everything." Delilah's expression softened, the careful control giving way to the kind of maternal pride that could illuminate entire rooms. "He walked at 11 months. His first word was book, which shouldn't surprise you since I read to him every night. He loves music, any kind, but especially piano. He's fearless about new foods, but completely terrified of the vacuum cleaner." Julian listened to 18 months of his son's life condensed into precious details, each revelation hitting him like a small miracle he'd missed. First words, first steps, preferences and fears, and the daily discoveries that made up the architecture of early childhood. Does he ask about me?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and slightly suffocating. Delilah was quiet for a long moment, considering how to navigate truth without inflicting unnecessary damage. "He's 18 months old, Julian. He doesn't ask about anything beyond his immediate world. But sometimes when we're reading books with fathers in them, or when he sees other children with their dads at the playground," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I tell him his daddy loves him very much but lives far away. The simple fiction hit Julian harder than elaborate explanations would have. His son had a narrative about him. Incomplete, protective, designed to shield an 18-month-old from the complexity of adult failure and missed connections. Far away, Julian repeated. It was easier than explaining something I didn't understand myself. Elliot had grown quiet in Julian's arms. The combination of new surroundings and emotional energy apparently triggering the drowsiness that overtook toddlers without warning. His head settled against Julian's chest, with the trusting weight of someone who had never learned that safety could be temporary. "He's tired," Delilah said. "It's past his bedtime, and this is a lot of stimulation for someone so small." Julian looked down at his sleeping son, his son, God help him, his actual son, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The carefully controlled world he'd built over 24 months suddenly seemed not just incomplete, but actively hostile to everything that mattered. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. Nobody knows how to be a parent. You learn by doing it, day by day, mistake by mistake. But I've missed so much already. 18 months of learning, of being there, his voice cracked, of being the person he needed me to be." Delilah leaned forward slightly, her expression softening with something that looked dangerously close to compassion. "Julian, you can't parent backwards. You can only start from where you are. Where I am is 18 months behind and completely unprepared for any of this. Where you are is holding your son for the first time and trying to figure out how to move forward. That's exactly where you need to be." The simplicity of the statement hit him like revelation. Julian had spent 24 months perfecting the art of strategic planning, of anticipating every possible outcome and preparing elegant solutions for complex problems. But fatherhood wasn't a business challenge or a therapeutic goal. It was presence day by day, moment by moment, with no guarantee of success and no instruction manual for the specific combination of joy and terror that came with loving someone more than your own life. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know." Delilah's honesty was both frightening and oddly comforting. "I came here tonight to tell you the truth, not because I had a plan for what comes after. Do you want me to be part of his life?" The question had been burning in Julian's chest since the moment he'd seen Elliot's face, but he was terrified of the answer. What if 18 months of single motherhood had convinced Delilah that their son was better off without the complication of a father who'd proven he could disappear when life became difficult? "That depends," she said carefully. "On what? On whether you want to be part of his life or whether you want to control how you're part of his life. There's a difference." The observation cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong between them during their marriage. Julian's need to manage love instead of simply accepting it, to create systems and structures that could contain the beautiful chaos of human connection. "I want to be his father," Julian said quietly. "I want to learn how to be the person he deserves. That means showing up even when it's inconvenient. It means putting his needs before your comfort. It means accepting that love isn't something you can organize or optimize or fix when it gets messy." Each word felt like a small surgery, removing pieces of the armor Julian had spent years constructing. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't want to defend himself. He wanted to be worthy of the sleeping child in his arms. From the living room came the sounds of his dinner party continuing, conversations growing more animated as wine flowed, and the evening progressed toward its carefully orchestrated conclusion. 22 people who had no idea that the host's entire understanding of his own life had been rewritten in the space of an hour. "I should probably go," Delilah said quietly. "This is a lot for one evening, and you have guests." The thought of her leaving, of Elliot leaving, hit Julian like panic. "Wait, please." He looked down at his sleeping son, then back at her. Would it be possible for me to see him again? Soon? Julian, you can see him whenever you want. He's your son, but you're his mother. You've been everything to him for 18 months. I don't want to disrupt what you've built." For the first time since she'd arrived, Delilah's careful composure cracked slightly. "What I've built is a life where he's safe and loved and has everything he needs. But what I haven't been able to give him is a father. If you want to be that person, really want to be that person, not just the idea of it, then we'll figure out how to make it work." Julian stood carefully, Elliot still sleeping against his chest, and walked to the window that overlooked Central Park. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the city wrapped in pristine white that made everything look possible again. "I want to be that person," he said. "I want to learn how to love him the way he deserves to be loved." "Then we start tomorrow," Delilah said simply. Not with grand gestures or elaborate plans, just, we start. Julian turned back to her, this woman who had carried their child alone for 18 months and still found the grace to offer him a chance at redemption he wasn't sure he'd earned. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me yet. Ask me again in 6 months when you've realized that being a parent means never having a clean shirt, or 8 hours of sleep, or a conversation that isn't interrupted by someone who needs something right now. Despite everything, Julian almost smiled. That sounds terrifying. It is. It's also the most beautiful thing you'll ever do. As if summoned by the conversation about him, Elliot stirred in Julian's arms, opening steel gray eyes that were exactly like looking into a mirror of his own childhood. He looked around the unfamiliar room with sleepy confusion before his gaze settled on Julian's face. Dada, he said again, the word carrying no weight beyond simple recognition. Julian's chest tightened with love so fierce it felt like drowning and breathing for the first time simultaneously. Yes, he whispered. Dada's here. And for the first time in 24 months, Julian Ashford felt like he might actually know what winning looked like. Julian stood outside his study door for 30 seconds, gathering the fragments of the man he'd been an hour ago and trying to reassemble them into something that could face a room full of people who knew nothing about the seismic shift that had just occurred in his life. Delilah had left through the private elevator, Elliot sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, but the weight of holding his son still lingered in Julian's arms like phantom sensation. His reflection in the hallway mirror showed a man who looked exactly the same as before. Midnight blue Tom Ford suit perfectly tailored, dark hair still styled to precision, steel gray eyes clear and focused. But Julian could see what the mirror couldn't capture, the fundamental rewiring that had taken place in his chest, the way 18 months of missed fatherhood had settled into his bones like knowledge he'd always carried but never accessed. The sounds of his dinner party drifted through the penthouse, sophisticated laughter, the gentle clink of crystal, conversations about market projections and vacation homes, and the comfortable concerns of people whose biggest crisis was choosing between winter in Aspen or spring in Tuscany. Julian had been one of those people 2 hours ago. Now their worries felt like they belonged to a different species. He straightened his tie, checked his cuffs, and walked back into his own life like an actor returning to a play where all the other performers had continued their scenes without him. Julian, Richard Pemberton, senior partner at the law firm that handled Nutrigenesis contracts, approached with a crystal tumbler of 18-year-old scotch and the bonhomie of someone who'd been sampling the host's excellent liquor. There you are. We were beginning to think you'd abandoned us for more interesting company. More interesting company. Julian thought of Elliot's small fingers investigating the texture of his tie, the way his son had said Dada, with the casual certainty of someone who'd been waiting 18 months to use the word properly. Apologies, Julian said, his voice sounding normal despite the fact that everything inside him had been rearranged. Unexpected business matter. On Christmas Eve? That's dedication to the Empire. Richard raised his glass in a mock toast. Though I suppose money never sleeps even during the holidays. Julian accepted the observation with the practiced smile of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of surface-level conversation, but the words felt like they belonged to a different language now. Money never sleeps. Empire building. The vocabulary of his old life, suddenly as foreign as Sanskrit. Across the room, Caroline caught his eye and excused herself from a conversation about private school admissions. She approached with the careful grace of someone navigating emotional landmines, her auburn hair catching the light from the chandelier, and her steel gray eyes, so similar to Elliot's, Julian realized with a start, filled with questions she couldn't ask in front of 21 other people. Everything all right? She asked quietly, positioning herself so that her back was to the other guests. Everything's... Julian paused, searching for words that could encompass the complete reconstruction of his understanding of himself. Everything's different. Caroline's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like relief mixed with anticipation. Good different or catastrophically life-altering different? Both. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. Where are they now? Gone. Elliot was tired and this was... Julian gestured vaguely at the elegant chaos around them. Too much for an 18-month-old. 18 months. Caroline's voice carried the particular weight of someone doing mathematical calculations that involved missed birthdays and holidays and first everything. Jules, he's beautiful. He looks exactly like you did at that age. The observation hit Julian with unexpected force. Somewhere in his mother's house in Connecticut, there were photo albums filled with images of Julian at 18 months, dark hair falling in soft waves, steel gray eyes bright with curiosity, the same stubborn chin that Elliot had inherited along with his father's eye color. "I don't know what I'm doing," Julian admitted quietly. "Nobody knows what they're doing when they become a parent. You just figure it out as you go. But I've missed so much already." First words, first steps, 18 months of learning who he is and what he needs. Caroline placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Then you start from where you are now. You can't change what's behind you, but you can choose what happens next." The words echoed Delilah's advice from the study, and Julian found himself grateful for the women in his life who seemed to understand that healing meant moving forward rather than dwelling in regret. Julian. The voice belonged to Margaret Winters, one of Manhattan's most formidable social organizers, and the kind of woman who collected gossip like some people collected art. She approached with the predatory smile of someone who'd sensed a story worth telling. "You disappeared for quite a while. I hope everything's all right." "Everything's perfect," Julian said, surprised to discover that the words felt true despite being incomplete. "Just some family business." "Family business on Christmas Eve? How mysterious?" Margaret's eyes glittered with curiosity. "I thought I saw someone leaving through the private elevator earlier. A young woman with a child. Very pretty, though she looked familiar somehow." Julian felt Caroline tense beside him, ready to deflect or distract if necessary. But for the first time in years, Julian didn't feel the need to manage other people's perceptions or construct elaborate explanations to protect his privacy. "That was Delilah," he said simply. "My ex-wife." Margaret's eyebrows rose with the particular delight of someone who'd just been handed premium gossip. "How modern of you, maintaining friendly relations with former spouses. Though I must say the child was adorable. Those eyes, so distinctive." "Yes," Julian said, meeting Margaret's gaze directly. "He has the Ashford eyes." The statement hung in the air like expensive perfume. Present, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Margaret's expression shifted from curiosity to calculation, to the dawning realization that she'd stumbled onto something much more significant than a friendly post-divorce dinner invitation. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh my." Around them, conversations continued their elegant flow, but Julian could sense the subtle shift in attention that occurred when social hierarchies were suddenly rearranged by new information. He was no longer just Julian Ashford, successful CEO and eligible bachelor. He was Julian Ashford, father, with all the complexity and vulnerability that parenthood implied. "If you'll excuse me," Julian said politely, "I should check on dinner." He walked toward the kitchen with measured steps, leaving Margaret to process her discovery and Caroline to manage whatever social aftermath might follow. But for the first time since his divorce, Julian found that he didn't particularly care what other people thought about his personal life. In the kitchen, the catering staff moved with professional efficiency, putting finishing touches on a meal designed to impress rather than nourish. Beef Wellington that cost more per serving than most people spent on groceries in a week. Wine that had been aging in French cellars while Elliot was learning to walk. Food that belonged to the performance of success rather than the reality of connection. Julian's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Delilah's new phone, he realized. Elliot fell asleep in the car. "Thank you for tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." He stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you for giving me the chance to meet him. Sleep well." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, he asked for Dada when I put him in his crib. I told him Dada was thinking about him too. Julian's chest tightened with emotions he didn't have names for. Love and loss and the strange alchemy of grief mixed with joy that came with discovering you'd been a father for 18 months without knowing it. "Tell him Dada loves him," he typed back. "I will." Julian returned his phone to his pocket and walked back into his dinner party, where 21 people continued their elegant performance of sophisticated conversation. But now he moved among them like an anthropologist, studying a culture he'd once belonged to, but no longer quite understood. The man who had planned this evening, determined to prove his evolution and success to an ex-wife who no longer held any power over his carefully constructed world, felt like a stranger now. That man had been performing strength while drowning in isolation. That man had confused control with healing and believed that winning meant never having to be vulnerable. This man, the one who'd held his son for the first time and felt 18 months of missed love crash over him like a wave, understood that real strength meant showing up, even when you had no idea what you were doing. Real healing meant accepting that some gifts came disguised as chaos, and real winning meant being brave enough to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to find everything you actually needed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, his voice carrying across the penthouse with new authority, "if I could have your attention for a moment." Conversations paused, crystal glasses stilled, and 21 faces turned toward him with the polite expectation of a toast or announcement that would fit comfortably within the evening's elegant parameters. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," Julian began, "for celebrating Christmas Eve with me, for your friendship and support over the past few years. But I also want to share something with you." Caroline's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded encouragingly. "Tonight I learned that I'm a father. I have an 18-month-old son named Elliot, and he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Julian's voice remained steady, though his hands had begun to shake with the particular tremor that came not from anxiety, but from joy so fierce it felt like electricity. "I've missed the first 18 months of his life, but I intend to be present for everything that comes next." The silence that followed was profound, not uncomfortable but sacred, the kind of quiet that surrounded moments when someone's carefully constructed world cracked open to reveal something real underneath. Then Caroline began to applaud, and gradually the rest of the room joined her until Julian's penthouse filled with the sound of 21 people celebrating a transformation they didn't fully understand, but recognized as significant. Julian stood in the center of his perfect dinner party, surrounded by people congratulating him on a development that had destroyed every assumption he'd held about his own life, and for the first time in years, he felt completely, authentically, himself. The man he'd been building since his divorce was impressive but incomplete. The man he was becoming, father, partner, someone brave enough to love without controlling the outcome, felt like coming home to a version of himself he'd never known existed. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crystalline silence that only snow could create, transforming Manhattan into a world where anything felt possible. Julian stood in his penthouse kitchen at dawn, still wearing the clothes from the night before, staring at his phone and the address Delilah had texted him 3 hours earlier. 1247 Brooklyn Heights Promenade, apartment 4B. "Come whenever you're ready." He'd been ready since the moment she left. Ready and terrified and completely unprepared for everything that being ready actually meant. The dinner party had ended just past midnight with 21 people who now knew that Julian Ashford, the controlled, successful CEO they'd thought they understood, was a father learning to navigate love without a roadmap. Carolyn had stayed behind to help clean up, but mostly to ensure her brother didn't collapse under the weight of his own emotional breakthrough. "You don't have to go today," she'd said as the last guest departed. "Give yourself time to process this." But Julian had spent 18 months not being present for his son. Time to process felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. Now he stood in front of a Brooklyn brownstone that was the architectural opposite of his Manhattan penthouse. Warm where his was sleek, inviting where his was impressive. The kind of building where families lived real lives instead of performing successful ones. The snow had covered the front steps and the small garden, making everything look like a scene from a Christmas card designed by someone who understood that beauty lived in authenticity rather than expense. He climbed the steps with the measured pace of someone approaching either salvation or his own emotional destruction, still unsure which was more likely. At the 4th-floor landing, he paused outside apartment 4B, listening to the sounds that leaked through the door. Delilah's voice reading something aloud, Elliot's delighted laughter, the particular domestic symphony that belonged to a morning when love was the primary agenda. Julian knocked softly, 3 gentle taps that felt like prayer. The door opened and Delilah appeared wearing a cream-colored sweater and jeans, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger, softer, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with before anxiety and pride had poisoned everything they'd built together. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi." They looked at each other for a moment that contained 24 months of silence and 18 months of secrets, and the weight of a Christmas morning that neither had expected to share. Behind Delilah, Julian could hear Elliot's voice. "Mama, book, more," and the sound of his son's existence hit him like physical relief. "Come in," Delilah said, stepping aside. Julian entered an apartment that was everything his penthouse wasn't. Small but not cramped, decorated with thoughtful touches rather than expensive statements, filled with the evidence of actual life being lived. Children's books stacked on surfaces, a high chair positioned near a kitchen table that bore the honorable scars of daily use, photographs that captured moments rather than poses. And in the living room, sitting on a soft rug surrounded by picture books and wooden blocks, was Elliot. He wore red pajamas decorated with tiny Christmas trees, his dark hair sticking up in the particular chaos that belonged to toddlers who'd recently woken up. And when he saw Julian, his face lit up with recognition that hit his father like lightning. "Dada!" Elliot announced, dropping the book he'd been examining and crawling toward Julian with the determined efficiency of someone who had important business to conduct. Julian knelt on the rug, and Elliot climbed into his arms with the casual trust of someone who'd spent exactly 0 time questioning whether fathers could be counted on to catch their children. The weight of his son settled against his chest like missing piece of himself he'd never known was absent. "Merry Christmas, buddy," Julian whispered. "Kiss, miss," Elliot repeated seriously, then pointed toward the small Christmas tree in the corner. Tree. Lights. It was a modest tree, nothing like the professionally decorated 12-footer in Julian's penthouse, but it was perfect in the way that things chosen with love rather than money always were. Handmade ornaments hung alongside store-bought ones, and presents wrapped in paper that had been selected for joy rather than sophistication sat beneath branches that had been decorated by someone who understood that Christmas belonged to children. "He's been awake since 5, Delilah said, settling onto the couch with a cup of coffee that smelled like comfort rather than Italian perfection. "Too excited about the presents to sleep anymore." "Presents," Elliot agreed enthusiastically, then looked at Julian with the focused attention of someone explaining something very important. "Santa." Julian's chest tightened as he realized that this was Elliot's second Christmas, and he'd missed the first one entirely. Missed the wonder of watching someone discover the magic of Christmas morning. Missed the opportunity to be the person who made that magic happen. "Should we open them?" Julian asked, looking to Delilah for guidance in the parenting etiquette he'd never learned. She nodded, and for the next hour Julian experienced Christmas through the eyes of someone who found wrapping paper as exciting as the gifts it contained. Elliot approached each present with scientific curiosity, examining the paper and ribbons before tearing into them with delighted efficiency. There were books and wooden toys and clothes that had been chosen for comfort rather than fashion. Simple gifts that spoke of thoughtful attention to an 18-month-old's developmental needs rather than expensive gestures designed to impress adults. "I brought something too," Julian said, when the official presents had been exhausted. He pulled a small wrapped box from his coat pocket, something he'd picked up from his penthouse before driving to Brooklyn, a decision made on instinct rather than strategy. Inside was a pocket watch that had belonged to Julian's grandfather, then his father, then him. 3 generations of Ashford men who'd carried time in their vest pockets and promises in their hearts. It was far too sophisticated for an 18-month-old, but it was the only heirloom Julian owned that felt worthy of passing down. "For when he's older," Julian explained to Delilah, "so he knows he belongs to something larger than just the moment he's living in." Delilah's eyes filled with tears so quickly that Julian wondered if he'd made a mistake, chosen something too heavy with implication for a relationship they were still learning how to navigate. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Are you sure? I've never been sure of anything more important in my life." Elliot, meanwhile, had discovered that the empty wrapping paper boxes made excellent drums and was conducting a percussion concert with wooden blocks as drumsticks. The apartment filled with the chaotic music of a toddler who understood that joy was meant to be expressed at maximum volume. Julian watched his son create beautiful noise from simple materials and felt something inside him unlock completely. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the milestones and memories, but the daily proof that love could be loud and messy, and completely unconcerned with anyone's definition of perfect. "Delilah," he said quietly, under cover of Elliot's enthusiastic drumming. "Yes? I want to do this right. Not just today, not just when it's convenient, but all of it. The middle of the night fevers and the terrible twos and the first day of school and everything that comes with being present for someone else's entire life." She studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to distinguish between promises and performance. "That's a long-term commitment, Julian. It means showing up even when it's hard, even when he's not cute and cooperative, even when being a parent interferes with everything else you think you want. I know. It means accepting that you can't control how much he loves you or when he needs you or what kind of person he grows up to be. It means loving him exactly as he is, instead of trying to shape him into what you think he should become." Each word felt like a small surgery, removing pieces of the armor Julian had worn for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to move without it. But for the first time in years, he didn't want protection from vulnerability. He wanted to be worthy of it. "I know that too," he said, "and I want it anyway. All of it." Elliot had grown bored with his percussion concert, and was now investigating a picture book about farm animals, providing sound effects for each page with the dedication of someone who took his artistic responsibilities seriously. "Moo," he said seriously, pointing to a cow. "Very good," Delilah praised. "What sound does the pig make?" "Oink." Julian watched this interaction, mother and son sharing the kind of simple intimacy that built the foundation of entire lives, and felt the last of his resistance to love without guarantees dissolve completely. "There's something else I want," he said quietly. Delilah looked at him with patient attention, the kind that belonged to someone who'd learned to listen for subtext and genuine intention. "I want the chance to love you again, not the way I did before, when I was trying to manage my feelings instead of experiencing them, but the way you deserve to be loved. Present, patient, without needing to control the outcome." The words hung in the air like incense, sacred and slightly overwhelming. Julian had spent 24 months perfecting the art of emotional self-protection, and now he was offering to dismantle every defense he'd built in favor of the terrifying possibility that some things were worth risking everything to protect. Delilah was quiet for a long time, watching Elliot turn pages and narrate his own story about farm animals, who apparently all lived in the same barnyard and had complex social relationships. "Julian," she said finally, "I loved the man I married. But I couldn't save him from himself, and I couldn't build a life with someone who was afraid to be human in front of me. I'm not afraid anymore." "What changed?" Julian looked at Elliot, who had abandoned his book in favor of climbing onto the couch between them, settling against Delilah with the casual ownership of someone who'd never doubted that mothers were the safest place in any universe. "Him," Julian said simply, "realizing that I'd rather be terrified and present than safe and alone. Understanding that love isn't something you earn through perfect behavior. It's something you receive through showing up, day after day exactly as you are." Delilah reached over and touched his hand. Just briefly, just enough to test whether the current between them was still live after 24 months of careful separation. It was. "We'll have to take this slowly," she said, "for all of us, but especially for him. He doesn't understand complicated adult relationships, and I won't let him become collateral damage if we can't figure out how to love each other better than we did before." "Slowly," Julian agreed, "day by day, moment by moment, until we know who we are when we're brave enough to be completely honest with each other." Elliot had grown sleepy against Delilah's side, the excitement of Christmas morning beginning to give way to the drowsiness that overtook toddlers without warning. But before he fell asleep, he looked at Julian with steel-gray eyes that held no judgment, no expectation beyond the simple request to be loved exactly as he was. "Dada stay?" he asked with the devastating honesty that only children could manage. Julian felt 18 months of missed moments and 24 months of careful emotional control crumble completely, replaced by love so fierce it felt like drowning and learning to breathe simultaneously. "Yes," he whispered, "Dada's going to stay." And for the first time since he was a child himself, Julian Ashford understood what coming home actually felt like. 18 months later, Julian Ashford stood in the kitchen of the Brooklyn Heights townhouse they'd bought 6 months ago, attempting to negotiate with a 3-year-old who had very strong opinions about the structural integrity of his pancake breakfast. Elliot sat in his booster seat, dark hair still messy from sleep, steel-gray eyes focused with scientific precision on the task of determining whether pancakes tasted better when eaten in precise squares or chaotic, syrup-soaked chunks. "Dada, look," Elliot announced, holding up a piece of pancake that had been systematically deconstructed into its component parts. "Helicopter." Julian examined the offering with the serious attention that 3-year-olds demanded for their culinary artwork. "That's definitely a helicopter. Very aerodynamic design." "Aero what?" "It means it can fly really well." Elliot considered this information, then promptly launched the pancake helicopter across the kitchen with impressive accuracy, where it landed on Winston's nose. Winston, the golden retriever they'd adopted 3 months ago, accepted this development with the patient resignation of a dog who'd learned that living with small humans meant occasionally wearing breakfast as an accessory. "Elliot James Ashford," Delilah's voice carried from the doorway, rich with the particular blend of exasperation and amusement that belonged to mothers everywhere. "What have we discussed about using food as projectiles?" "That Winston doesn't mind?" Elliot offered hopefully. Julian watched his wife, still a word that made his chest tighten with gratitude, enter their kitchen wearing paint-splattered jeans and one of his old Columbia t-shirts, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that had been styled by someone with more important things to do than perfect hairstyles. She looked beautiful in the way that belonged to Saturday mornings and real life, and the kind of love that grew stronger when witnessed in ordinary moments. They'd been married for 4 months now, a small ceremony in Central Park with 20 guests who understood that some love stories were worth celebrating twice. Caroline had cried through the entire ceremony, and Elliot had served as ring bearer with the solemn dignity of someone who took his ceremonial responsibilities very seriously. "Winston minds?" Delilah continued, kissing Julian's cheek as she passed him to pour coffee from the pot he'd started before Elliot's helicopter aviation program had commenced. "He's just too polite to complain about being used as target practice." "Sorry, Winston," Elliot said seriously, then brightened considerably. "Dada, can we go to the park today? I want to show you the big slide." The big slide. Julian had been introduced to this particular piece of playground equipment approximately 47 times over the past 18 months, each visit treated by Elliot as if it were his first discovery of the gravitational principles that made sliding possible. "After we finish breakfast and get dressed," Julian said, settling into the chair next to his son with coffee that tasted like home rather than Italian sophistication. "And after we clean up Winston." Delilah had opened her laptop and was reviewing the patient files for the pediatric nutrition clinic she now ran, a practice that had grown from her work at the Brooklyn facility into something that served families throughout the city. Her success had nothing to do with Julian's connections and everything to do with her gift for making children believe that healthy food could be delicious, and parents believe that they were capable of nurturing their families without perfect knowledge. "Doctor," Maya called, she said without looking up from her screen. "She wants to know if we're still coming to dinner tomorrow night, and whether Elliot is still planning to marry her daughter when they grow up." "I am," Elliot announced. "Sophie's my best friend, and you're supposed to marry your best friend. Right, Dada?" Julian met Delilah's eyes over their son's head, and the look that passed between them contained 18 months of learning how to love each other without trying to fix or control or improve the love they were receiving. They'd attended couples therapy, learned to fight without withdrawing, practiced the difficult art of being completely honest about their needs and fears and the 1,000 small disappointments that accompanied any attempt to build a life with another human being. It had been harder than Julian expected and more rewarding than he'd ever imagined. "Sometimes you marry your best friend," Julian said carefully. "But first, you have to learn how to be the kind of person someone would want to be best friends with forever." "I'm already that person," Elliot said with the confident certainty of someone who'd never doubted his own worthiness of love. Delilah laughed, the sound that had become Julian's favorite music, the daily proof that joy could be found in pancake helicopters and 3-year-old wisdom, and mornings when the most important decision was whether to go to the big slide or the swings first. "Yes, you are," she agreed. "But Sophie might want to go to college and travel and discover who she is before she decides whether she wants to marry anyone. She can do all that," Elliot said pragmatically. "I'll wait." Julian's chest tightened with pride and love and the particular terror that belonged to parents who realized their children were already demonstrating emotional intelligence that had taken the adults decades to develop. His phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Dad's asking when you're bringing his grandson to Connecticut again. I told him Elliot has a social calendar that would make a diplomat weep, but he's insistent." Julian smiled, thinking of his father, who had taken to grandfatherhood with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting 72 years for an audience that would appreciate his collection of terrible jokes and off-key singing. The first time Julian had brought Elliot to Connecticut, his son had fallen asleep in his grandfather's arms while listening to a story about the family dog from 1987, and Julian had understood that some gifts were worth waiting for, even when you hadn't known you were waiting. "Your grandfather wants to see you again," Julian told Elliot, who had finished his aerodynamic breakfast and was now attempting to teach Winston how to high-five. "Grandpa Joe, he has the big garden and the scary basement." "The basement isn't scary, buddy, it's just old." "Old is scary," Elliot said, with the wisdom of someone who understood that unfamiliar things required careful investigation before they could be trusted. Julian had thought the same thing for most of his adult life. That age meant obsolescence, that the past was something to be managed or overcome, rather than integrated. Now he understood that some things grew more valuable with time, more essential rather than less. Love that had survived mistakes and miscommunication, trust that had been broken and carefully rebuilt, families that had been scattered and consciously gathered back together. Delilah closed her laptop and joined them at the table, stealing a piece of Julian's toast with the casual intimacy of someone who'd earned the right to share food and space and the comfortable silence that belonged to people who no longer needed to perform their happiness for each other. "I have a patient this afternoon," she said, 3-year-old who's decided that vegetables are fundamentally evil, and her parents are conspirators in a plot to poison her with nutrients. "Sounds familiar," Julian said, glancing at Elliot, who was now sharing his remaining pancake with Winston in a display of interspecies cooperation. "Different kind of challenge. This one involves a child who's smart enough to argue about antioxidants." Julian watched his wife discuss her work with the passion that belonged to people who'd found their purpose in making other people's lives better, and felt the same surge of admiration that had first drawn him to her 8 years ago. But now it was tempered with the deeper appreciation that came from watching someone choose to love you, even after they'd seen you at your worst. "I was thinking," Delilah said casually, "about something Dr. Reeves mentioned in our session last week." Julian's attention sharpened. They'd continued couples therapy even after they'd remarried, understanding that some skills required ongoing practice rather than one-time mastery. About what? About how growth isn't something you complete. It's something you choose every day in small ways that matter more than grand gestures. The observation hit Julian with the force of truth that had been lived rather than simply understood intellectually. 18 months of learning to be Elliot's father had taught him that love was indeed a daily choice. To be present when he was tired, patient when he was frustrated, honest about his own limitations while still showing up consistently for someone who depended on him completely. Meaning I think you figured out how to choose us every day in ways that matter. The simple statement carried weight that years of elaborate declarations couldn't have matched. Julian had spent the first half of his adult life believing that love was something you earned through perfect behavior, and the second half learning that it was something you practiced through imperfect presence. "I choose you too," he said quietly. "Every day, in every way I know how." Elliot, apparently bored with adult conversation that didn't involve dinosaurs or playground equipment, had climbed down from his booster seat and was now constructing an elaborate fort using dining room chairs and the tablecloth, with Winston serving as either architect or structural support. "Should we stop that?" Julian asked. "Probably," Delilah said. "In about 10 minutes. Let him finish his engineering project first." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching their son create beautiful chaos from household items, and Julian reflected on the strange mathematics of happiness that had taken him 39 years to understand. 2 years ago, he'd believed that success meant controlling every variable, that strength meant never needing anyone, that love was something you managed rather than experienced. Now he knew that the best things in life were also the most unpredictable. That real strength meant being brave enough to need people and let them need you in return. That love was something you practiced rather than something you achieved, something that grew stronger through daily attention rather than perfect execution. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from Maya, Sophie and Elliot from their playdate yesterday, both covered in finger paint and grinning like conspirators who'd just discovered the secret to eternal happiness. "Look," he said, showing the photo to Delilah. She smiled with the particular warmth that belonged to mothers watching their children discover friendship. "They're going to be trouble together. The best kind of trouble." Elliot emerged from his fort construction project and climbed into Julian's lap with the casual ownership of someone who'd never doubted that fathers were meant to be climbed on, leaned against, and used as jungle gyms when more traditional entertainment wasn't available. "Dada," he said seriously, "I love you bigger than the whole sky." It was a phrase he'd learned from a book Delilah read to him every night, the story of a parent's love that was bigger than any measurement system children could imagine. But hearing it applied to his own worth in his son's universe hit Julian with the force of grace he'd never expected to receive. "I love you bigger than the whole sky too, buddy." "Even bigger than that?" "Even bigger than that." Elliot considered this mathematical impossibility with the focused attention of someone who took matters of love very seriously. "Bigger than space? Bigger than space. Bigger than infinity? Especially bigger than infinity." Satisfied with this cosmic accounting of affection, Elliot settled against Julian's chest with the trusting weight of someone who'd never learned that love could be conditional or temporary or anything other than the fundamental organizing principle of the universe. Julian looked across the table at Delilah, who was watching this exchange with eyes bright with tears that belonged to someone who understood that some moments were too precious for anything other than complete presence. He thought about the man he'd been 2 Christmases ago, controlled, isolated, performing success while slowly drowning in his own emotional armor. That man had been impressive, but incomplete. That man had confused winning with never needing anyone, strength with never showing weakness, love with never being vulnerable. This man, father, husband, someone brave enough to choose love every day even when it meant giving up the illusion of control, had learned that real winning meant being worthy of someone else's complete trust. That real strength meant showing up even when you had no idea what you were doing. That real love meant accepting the terrifying gift of someone else's heart and proving yourself worthy of that gift through consistent presence rather than perfect performance. Outside their kitchen window, Brooklyn Heights bustled with the particular energy of Saturday mornings. Families heading to parks, couples sharing coffee, children discovering that the world was full of wonders worth exploring. Julian had once lived above all of that, literally and figuratively, observing life from the safety of distance. Now he was part of it, participant rather than observer, connected rather than protected, present rather than perfect. "Ready for the park, buddy?" he asked Elliot. "Ready." As they gathered coats and shoes and the various supplies that 3-year-olds required for successful expeditions to playground equipment they'd visited hundreds of times before, Julian's phone rang. "Doctor." Reeves's number flashed on the screen. "Julian?" His therapist's voice carried across the line with professional warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just getting ready to take my son to the park," Julian said, surprised by how easily the words came, how natural it felt to identify himself first and foremost as Elliot's father. "I wanted to follow up on something from our last session. You mentioned that you'd been thinking about what growth looks like when it becomes a daily practice rather than a destination." Julian watched Elliot attempt to put on shoes that had somehow become more complicated than rocket science, while Delilah helped with the patient efficiency of someone who'd learned that 3-year-olds operated on their own timeline. "I have," he said. "And what have you discovered?" Julian considered the question while Elliot finally achieved shoe success and performed a victory dance that involved significant amounts of jumping and arm waving. "That love is something you practice," he said finally. "Something you choose every day in small ways that matter more than grand gestures. That being present is harder than being perfect, but infinitely more valuable. That's beautiful, Julian. Hold on to that." After the call ended, Julian joined his family at the door, Delilah adjusting Elliot's coat, Elliot explaining to Winston why dogs couldn't come to playgrounds but would definitely be included in the post-park debriefing, Winston accepting this information with the stoic dignity of someone who understood that love sometimes meant being left behind for a few hours. "Ready?" Delilah asked. Julian looked at his wife and son, at the life they'd built together through daily choices to show up for each other, even when it was difficult, even when they didn't know what they were doing, even when love felt more like an act of faith than a guarantee of happiness. "Ready," he said, and as they walked out into the Brooklyn morning, Julian carried with him the knowledge that some gifts were worth waiting for, even when you didn't know you were waiting. That some love stories required being broken before they could be rebuilt into something stronger. That some victories looked nothing like what you'd planned, but everything like what you'd always needed. The man who'd invited his ex-wife to Christmas dinner, to prove he'd moved on, had learned something infinitely more valuable. That real moving on meant moving toward love rather than away from it, toward connection rather than protection, toward the beautiful chaos of building a life with people brave enough to love you exactly as you are. And for the first time in his life, Julian Ashford understood what coming home really meant. It meant choosing love, every day, in ways both small and profound. It meant being brave enough to stay. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.